That's my introduction. I'll hand over to John. So John now.
Very much, Simon, and great to see such a good crowd on a Friday evening when I'm sure, like me, you were dreaming of the weekend already beginning. My name is John McAuliffe. I'm a professor of poetry here at the Centre for New Writing at the university, and I'm also, as Simon said, the director of Creative Manchester. And Creative Manchester is a uni-wide research platform, and again, as Simon said, it's one of these things. It's part of the university's initiative to put together researchers and workers who are in the creative industries or who are working on topics associated with creativity or on creativity and well-being. So it's quite a broad sweep and it goes across all of the faculties. But clearly publishing is something that Creative Manchester is very interested in. We're delighted that Simon and MUP have agreed to run this series with us. I'm delighted as well that Simon can start us off by talking about MUP, which is the biggest press in the North, so it's a great insight into the range of work that's available to graduates. And there are, even here in the room and at the press, there are former students of mine I know who have gone on to work in publishing and have gone through MUP or are still working there. And one of the other reasons for it is that every year we have students, not just in our creative writing and literature courses, who are just very, very keen to find out about the kind of literature adjacent or arts adjacent work, which is where so many of you and so many of our former graduates will end up making their careers. And I guess the question I wanted to, and I'm going to just start, I'm going to be asking Simon questions today, but there's a chat function below, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And it would be really great if you could pop questions into the chat, and we'll come back to your questions towards the end of the session as well. But Simon, the question I suppose I wanted to start off with today was really just to ask you a little bit, and I know you've already mentioned working, at Cambridge UP, but if you could tell us about your route into publishing and what took you there in the first instance, and what kind of jobs you started off with in publishing and how that progressed.
So I didn't have a conventional route into publishing, but then maybe not many people do. But and I think that's probably true of academic publishing, which is kind of a specific area of publishing. I actually started off with my first interaction with academic publishing was when I was a postgraduate student studying for my PhD. I was working, one of the lecturers in the department I was working in had a small publishing company, amusingly called Intellect Limited. And he was publishing books and journals, as well as being a lecturer in computer science. And I ended up working on some of the projects that he was working on, and eventually ended up being a book reviewer on one of his journals. And the journal was Artificial Intelligence Review. And this was in the mid-'80s, so a few years ago. But AI isn't new, it's been around for a while. And I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed both, managing the process of the reviewing process for the books. I also did review many of the books myself, but I just enjoyed just doing that work. Roll on a few years, I'm a lecturer in a psychology department, and I've continued to enjoy working on publishing projects with publishers. And I found that I really enjoyed working on these projects, largely I think because they are they have a beginning, a middle, and an end, as it were. Whereas I think a lot of academic activity, and not that I don't want to put people off academia, is a bit of a treadmill, and you're doing a lot of things the same. And but you start on a project and it comes out and it's a book and it looks great. Anyway, I enjoyed working on these projects. But I think more importantly, I enjoyed working with the people who are working in publishing, and I got some encouragement about maybe thinking about working in publishing myself. Anyway, so the answer to the question, how did I get started in publishing, is that I answered an ad I saw in the New Scientist. And the ad was for a new commissioning or acquisitions editor with a company based in Boston in the US. So I put in an application, and to my surprise, I got an interview. Anyway, I went along for the interview, and it was going okay. It was actually, the interview was quite serious. It was with the president of the publishing company and the MD of the Boston office where this role was going to take place. Anyhow, I saw that the MD wasn't particularly impressed with me, and I sort of saw my opportunity sort of floating away a little bit after having got that far. And I made a pitch for a slightly different job, which was not about computer science, which I had worked in, but actually my background is more psychology and the interface of computer science with philosophy and language and so on, which was becoming a field called cognitive science then. So I made a pitch for a job publishing in cognitive science. We wrapped up the interview and I went home. The next day they called me and they said that they're not going to offer me the job for commissioning editor for computer science in Boston, but they would offer me a job at their headquarters in the Netherlands for a job as the commissioning editor for cognitive science. So that was very nice. And one thing led to another, and I turned up there. They showed me my office and an assistant, gave me an American Express card for my expenses, and told me to get on with it. So kind of a really nice entry into publishing, and I have to say it's been all downhill ever since. So so I was extremely lucky, and I guess, I was hired because of my knowledge of the field and the areas and where the field was moving. I obviously wasn't hired for my publishing skills, which were, which weren't great at the time, but obviously I understood about publishing. I had some experience, but not that much. I learned much later, actually, that the company had been talking about moving into this area that I made a pitch for, and that the very editor that was supposed to be in that role had resigned around about the time we had the interview. So I guess timing is everything. So anyway, so it wasn't a conventional route. You don't have to be an academic to get to work in academic publishing. Most people are, going in at an entry level as an editorial assistant, marketing assistant, and so on. So it's sort of unusual. And I wasn't joking about it's all been downhill ever since. I've never had a full-time assistant. And I've never been sort of really left alone and told to get on with it. I did have some terrific colleagues, though, who actually did teach me about publishing and got me up to speed.
I suppose one of the things that's very interesting about that, Simon, is how international the university presses are. That it's Boston and the Netherlands and the UK. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about what it is exactly that's so distinctive about this branch of publishing, which is it's a huge part of publishing, really, and the university press sector, especially in the UK.
Yeah, well, it's not just the University Press, of course, that publishes material that's relevant to universities, but I think the feature is that the nature and business of academia is global, and particularly when it's published in English, and the language of science is largely English. A lot of education in other countries outside the English-speaking countries is also done in English, or they're using English sources. So we have a head start being native English speakers and publishing in English. And in fact, when I was in the Netherlands, I was working in an office largely populated by Dutch people, but we worked in English. We spoke in the office in English, and we published in English. There was hardly any publishing in the Dutch language, which is actually only spoken by maybe 15 million people anyway. So yes, it's an international business. You do get to, in my case, I got to travel a lot. through my career, international conferences relevant. There's exhibitions with publishers, but more importantly, commissioning editors, acquisition editors, editorial staff. They go to talk to people who are giving presentations, to network and get to know about the field and the opportunities. So it's very much an international business.
And aside from it, what's international about it, the cycles of university publishing, what does the year look like, you know, and what is it about the you know, they're very long range projects and attachment to big projects, which, and even in the journals as they're coming through, the planning is it feels like the amount of planning is even larger than it would be in other fields. Is that right? Or
well, I think if we look at the two main formats in academic publishing are journals publishing and books publishing. In journals publishing, it's very much about the process. It's about getting making sure that there's enough content coming through, that it's reviewed at an appropriate time. But journals publishing is very standardized. Therefore, it was very quickly and easy to automate, and which is why it very quickly jumped to being mainly a digital publishing format. So digital publishing has been one of the revolutions, and probably something we'll talk about later. But you know, journals switched about 25 years ago, and the book publishing is very different. With journals publishing, your relationship is with the editor, not with the author, and often it's with perhaps with the society who publishes the journal. But with book publishing and what we call as long form publishing, takes a longer time. It's a very different process, and your relationship is with the author, the direct producer of that, and there's not much that mediates that relationship. So in journals publishing, there's obviously peer review, but often this peer review is handled by peer review systems. So as I say, it's highly automated. I would say that book publishing, particularly academic monograph publishing, you know, the high-level research books, it's very much more of a personal relationship. It's a long-term relationship, and we're looking at a life cycle to develop a book, usually between 2 and 3 years, from the initial discussion and contract through to the submission of manuscript, working on the manuscript through production and final publication. Now, I say 2 to 3 years. That would be great if it was 2 to 3 years. Sometimes it could be 10 to 20 years, but we try not to encourage that. But we do have, and I have worked on projects that have been in gestation for 10 plus years.
Yes. Well, that's great. I'm always relieved to hear stories like that, Simon.
I'm not encouraging it.
Yes. So I guess one of the things that I know this, I suppose, from poetry publishing and from other journal and arts publishing more generally, is how digital has been a massive change, but there have also been publishing as an industry, it seems, and MUP as well. Just in the time that you've been there, it has changed again. I wondered if you could talk about, first of all, about more generally, what the digital change has meant, and then kind of what are the largest changes you think you have seen alongside that in your career, and then I might ask you specifically about MUP in a minute.
Yeah. So. Well, I guess I worked for the previous 10 years before joining MUP. I've been at MUP now for 5 years. I worked with Cambridge University Press, and I was managing their journals operation. So prior to going back into journals publishing, I'd actually worked for 7 years outside of journals publishing. And when I went back into journals publishing, I can tell you that the only thing that had changed was that it had become automated, that the digital revolution had hit journals publishing. But the processes were the same. The issues were the same. It was, decent editorial strategy, peer review, making sure that the journals were publishing in, papers that were relevant to obviously the journal, and the journal was developing and keeping track with trends and so on. But the two things that have really impacted publishing over the last couple of years, I mean, it has been digital. It's got to be number one. But it's happened in different ways. I've mentioned with the journals that it happened, I would argue, 25 years ago, and it's continued to evolve and become more and more sophisticated. In the book side of the world, it only really happened in the last 5 to 10 years, and probably only really in academic publishing in the last 5, and massively accelerated by the last 2, of course, with lockdown and the inability to get print copies and distribute them. So certainly digital has had a major impact in being able to disseminate and supply information to the higher education market. The other thing that's happened at the same time and has largely facilitated this is there's been an explosion of publishing, so that everyone is publishing everywhere in every topic all the time.
Yeah.
And managing that information would not be possible without it being largely managed by a digital process, including search and discovery and so on. So the search and discovery of information has allowed that. And probably the next thing I'm going to mention is also related to the digital revolution, which is the increasing rise and dominance of open access as a publishing option, as a publishing model within publishing. Now, I don't know whether the audience knows what open access is. I expect most of you are familiar with what open access is.
It would be great if you were able to just talk people through it, though, because it is a intriguing enough concept. Yeah. So
the traditional model of publishing is that the publisher invests and pays to produce a product, and the end user, the customer, then pays a fee to buy it. So you go to a bookshop, you buy a book, you take out a subscription to a journal. Now, within most university situations, the university is actually supplying you with these books that feel like they're free at the point of use, or the journals are free at the point of use, but actually the library has paid for those. The library has paid a fee for the book, a fee for the journal, or a subscription for the journal. Now, the open access model is more about paying up front for the services of a publisher to produce that book or that journal. So there's a fixed fee up front, and then once that book or journal article has been produced, then it is free to use for everybody. Not just a specific university or a specific country or specific market, but for everyone anywhere. And because it's predominantly a digital model, then it's easy to disseminate that information. It's free for everyone to use everywhere. Now, that version of open access is usually called gold open access, where somebody comes up with a pot of money, and sometimes this can be quite expensive. So I'll give you an example. For a typical monograph publication, a high-level research monograph, you might be paying something like £10,000 to produce that. But it does mean that there is no further revenue able to be captured by that book once it's published. So with it, if you have a really successful book, you might well be able to generate £10,000 from that. You might well be able to generate much more than that. Typically, you're generating much less, it has to be said, on average. But there's that's basically the model. It's a model that has gained traction massively in the journals world, whereas because of its uniformity of format and price and everything, and because it's highly automated, it's a much easier model to charge a fee for per article, per paper, to be produced, to then be free to everybody. And that model I would argue, will become the dominant model within the next maybe 5 years. It's been 20, 30 years in development, and only over the last, again, maybe 5, 10 years has it really gained traction. This is typical of revolutions within technology. I would argue that it's usually a very, very slow burn, then something that happens very quickly, and the whole thing flips. And I think we're seeing that moment with journals publishing. I think it will take a little longer with books publishing. That's largely because a lot of books publishing is in the humanities and social sciences, which are actually not as well funded as the big science areas or medical publishing. So and they're a lot more diverse on the long format and the long gestation period of these books. It's a very different process, and I would suggest that if open access were to become the dominant model in that, it's going to take a much longer period for that to happen, but it may well happen.
And Simon, what are the proportions now, for you in terms of what, say of the 200 or so new books, and then say in terms of the journals, what, do you have a sense of what the proportion is this year as opposed to 3 years ago that are open access? Or
yeah, so actually over the last 5 years, we've been doing steadily between 10 and 15% of our output has been open access. And we would be seen as largely a successful publisher of open access book. There are actually not many other publishers, university presses, that would get anywhere near that number. So we've been unusually successful. It's the struggle. The reason why we haven't grown is the funding issue. That there just isn't the funding around to support authors to get grants that are going to come up with anything like the kind of figures needed to support a full transition to open access. So we rely on working with, for example, university libraries and people like the Wellcome Trust. So we do medical history publishing, grants from societies. Occasionally, authors themselves will come up with a contribution towards that. And it's just very difficult. So the 10 to 15% is actually not bad. Better than most university presses and better than the bigger university presses, but not as impressive as some of the big science publishers. Springer Nature is producing hundreds, if not thousands, of open access science books every year, and it's become a big business, whereas the whole idea was partially motivated by taking away the control from the big publishers. But guess what? The big publishers are attracting all the open access funding and doing all the open access publishing. But that's largely because that's what they're good at. And people want to publish with them. So for us, in journals, we used to be a much bigger journal publisher than we were. Before I joined, a strategic decision was made to stop focusing on journals and to move away from journals and just focus on books and grow the book side of the business. So there were a number of journals were sold off to some other publishers, but we did actually keep a few journals, and we've had about half a dozen journals, which we still publish. One of which is the John Rylands Research Journal, which is published with the library, and I think it is our last subscription journal. All our other journals are actually open access journals, and they're all published so that they're free to access. By the way, if you're a member of the University of Manchester, whether a staff member or a student, you can access all of Manchester University Press's content via the library system and our publishing platform. So all of our content is freely available to you.
That's great. That's a good plug. Absolutely, for everybody here from the university. I guess one of the questions that maybe people who are here today will be particularly interested in is, what kind of roles this changing dynamic, say, where MUP has moved away from journalists to some extent towards books. It has an open access element, is working with automated systems. But in terms of the kind of staff that you might have been working with, say, for the New Scientist or then at Cambridge, and the kind of staff that you have at MUP, has that kind of what you need as a publisher, has that changed, or do you still see it as having the same kind of team as you would have had previously?
I think the fundamentals are still the same. You require editorial staff, production staff, marketing staff, sales staff. So they're largely the fundamentals are the same. The digital environment and the processes that drive the publishing process have become largely, as I say, sort of almost end-to-end digital electronic process. So that has created new jobs. So now you might have a digital product manager or a content manager, people who work with metadata to help the aid with search and discovery of information. I would argue that marketing roles are increasingly digital, focused on social media. And so while the fundamentals have remained the same, and good publishing is, you achieve good publishing the same way, by engaging with the material, and that's very much a human process, working with the author, developing, doing the peer review process, and shaping the book through to publication. That's all still very, I would say, very much involved in it as a manual or a human process. But production systems are now highly automated, typesetting systems and so on. So that is the digital processes. They're all to support a much more efficient way of doing publishing. But it's probably on the consumption end that you actually see the biggest impact of that. So as a consumer, you're able to download digital books in various formats. You're able to search because the material has metadata and other information embedded in it. You're able to search and find information very quickly, very easily, and so on. So you'll have seen the impact of that as a consumer. Just in the terms of roles within publishing, I think it's most people are very attracted to editorial roles, but there are only a few editorial roles that ever come up in a publishing company, particularly the smaller ones. So if you did want to get into publishing, I would look at any and every aspect of publishing that you can get in, and I'd particularly encourage people not to be too sniffy about sales roles. The reason I say this is that being in a sales role is really interesting. It gets you to engage with the product. It gets you to understand your market. It gets you to understand why people might want to read or buy, or consume your product, and that is really valuable. The bottom line is that we're all in sales in the end. We're trying to produce something that we believe other people see value in and that they want. So, and many people who have come into sales roles and other roles, they've switched roles. They found actually that there's enough engagement and enjoyment in a role in sales that makes them still feel part of publishing, gets what they want to have out of publishing. And also the sales role now is it's not about lugging books around bookshops. Quite often it's about working with big content companies that aggregate data and content and then repackage and sell on to other libraries or other institutions and so on. Yeah. There's a whole other world of selling and packaging content now that didn't exist before.
And I guess one of the things I think that's really interested me about MUP in the last 5 years, Simon, I guess, is the range of material. So you still have, say, the Spencer series. You have a kind of an early modern period, but then there's a lot of books which are trade books, and which are conversations start, which are taking academic research out of the academic market and kind of trying to be part of larger policy, policy oriented conversation. And I think that must be a real, to have the team, you're still trying to keep an eye on the old readers and the readers who have been there and the library buyers and so on, alongside that other kind of set of readers. And I wondered if you could talk about how you keep both, and how does the press keep both ends up? Because I suppose the thing that I'm just interested in how you manage that. It's such a big spread.
So at the very highest level, how we manage that is that everything we do, all the formats and all the types of books that we produce, they're all tied back to a fundamental mission. And the mission is that what we are doing, we're an expression of, or an extension of, the university's mission, which is about producing great research, educating students, and just generally improving society. So we want to bring stuff to the conversation, if you like, that informs a debate, that raises the level of the debate, or increases the diversity of the debate. So anything we do, it is grounded in research. It has its research origins. I mean, most of our publishing activity is still very much what you would consider traditional university press publishing, i.e. that's there we do stuff on medieval history, and art history, international relations, law, quite a range of stuff, conventional sociology, anthropology, and so on. And some of this, of course, is also part of a national debate. So sociology, race is a big area of publishing. And these areas are also part of a wider conversation. So we publish books that will appeal to a broader market outside of the academic institution. We call these academic trade books. They're not trade books, is what you might see in a regular bookshop. They're not cookbooks, they're not political biographies, whatever, but they are books that want to engage a wider audience on a substantial topic, whether it's to do with the health service, as I say, or race, or areas like that. And those books are presented in a different way. They are written to appeal to a wider market. They're less academic, but it doesn't mean they're not academically grounded. Their origins are from research. They tend to be they tend to look more attractive. We take a lot of time and effort in the cover design. They're often in paperback format, and they're often at a price at which an individual can buy them. Therefore, you do see them in your better bookshops. You might not see them in WH Smith's, but you'll see them in Blackwell's across the road from our office, and the good bookshops, and any university bookstore you'd probably find an MUP book. So in terms of why we do it, or why we do a range of publishing, it's so we could reach a wider audience. And part of our mission is to disseminate that information. And part of doing more academic trade books is to fulfill that mission.
Great. Yeah, no, that's very useful, and it's great to see that reach. To see both strands of it thriving at the moment, Simon, and to get a sense of, I suppose, the different elements kind of coming from the same impetus as well. Now, I have a couple of more questions, but I think we might maybe open it up to those of you who are those of you who have signed up for today, who might have specific questions for Simon about what he's talked about, or questions that you might have about university presses more generally, or about MUP. We have just one question in the chat now, but if you would rather speak, please do raise your hand as well, and I think we'll be able to unmute you, and you can ask your question yourself as well. But as well, and of course, as always with these things, there are no stupid questions. and we all appreciate those of you who are able to just ask a question to get the conversation started, because very often that's where you'll really get at the thing that you'd be interested in finding out about. I'm going to read out Joe Hunter's question first of all, and Joe has put this in the chat. And but please do type something else in, or if you have something, just raise your hand and we'll spot you. So Joe wonders, Simon, I think you might be able to see that there, about the lag time in peer review for journal submissions, and he says that according to myth, it could be up to a year. And Joe, I can guarantee you that is not a myth. And is this a case of reviewers not being reimbursed, or what are the factors in the lag in peer review? So, Simon.
So, yeah, I mean, but there are a couple of factors here. Firstly, peer review is basically the process of obviously reviewing your peers' material, and most of the time it goes unrewarded. That is, there's no financial reward for this. Academics do it as part of they see it as part of their job, and as part of working within in academia, often to stay on top of issues, and so they can engage with the current, the up and coming issues, so that they can keep abreast of material. Others see it as a way of giving back and supporting early career researchers, so that they can help them shape their work to get published. The big issue here, though, is there's something I touched on earlier. There's been a massive explosion of publishing within the last 10, 20 years. So this is tied to the ability to get things published. Lots more journals coming online, lots more academics being held accountable and being basically had pressure on them to publish, and preferably to publish in a good journal, but actually just to publish in any journal and have a publication record. So there's a massive amount of pressure there. So all of this extra publishing requires extra resource, and peer reviewers are a resource, whether they're rewarded or not. And there's just not enough of them to go around. There aren't enough experts in all the fields. So I know some established academics, they're getting asked to review 50, 60 papers a week. Now they cannot possibly do that on top of their day job. But they do still continue to do it, but they pick and choose. They say, look, I reckon I can do maybe 2 or 3 a week. It depends on the field, and it depends on the level of peer review as well. I mean, some peer reviewers, will send back more comments than the length of the paper. Others will be very scant. Some of them are asked to do pro forma. They have a checklist and asked about things. So different things. So that really it's the sheer amount of work that's involved. Very popular journals obviously get masses of papers, and they are, just by virtue of being popular and so on, they are probably going to be slower. And so no amount of automation is going to speed up peer review. It does speed up peer review, but basically peer review systems, they have a pool of known reviewers, they have the subject areas, and they match the subject areas, the keywords, with those reviewers, and then they get sent out. But with so much coming in and so much pressure put on peer reviewers, that's the reason why. There have been some responses to this, actually. One of which John has just mentioned is, why do you pay peer reviewers? Well, if we had to reward all the peer reviewers with their actual value, I think it would bankrupt publishing. So, but there may be a reward system that could be put in place. This would only partially resolve it. One of the other ways of dealing with this is that actually some new approaches to publishing involve, particularly in science, the peer review process is only whether they're only looking at the paper and asking, is this science rigorous? Not are the findings interesting, shattering or whatever. Is the logic of the paper consistent? Is the experimental method clear and everything? And if it passes that hurdle, then we'll let it out into the community, and it'll get peer reviewed in the crowd, as it were. So then people will review whether it's a worthy paper, whether it's worth reading, whether it has made a contribution or not. Now that is a way of dealing with this. So in some ways, the standardization of peer review just to look at the method and not about its contribution takes a whole lot of work away, and a whole lot of the difficult work away. But then you have to ask yourself, what are you left with? And, and is it going to be reviewed fairly, appropriately once it's out there in the wild, as it were?
Very good. That's very interesting. I know myself, some of the stuff that gets sent to me for a review disappears after 3 days. You know, they really do, Joe, put pressure on you now to make sure that you are able to respond quickly. And if you're humming and hawing over it, it's gone. Even if you do, you know, into review it, because they really do try to speed up the processes. So we have, thank you very much, Joe. And there are a few more questions down the chat, and some are from the perspective of prospective academics who are thinking about their research, and then others who are thinking about what it is to work in this industry, which is great. So Hina asks, as a PhD student, what would be the best way to engage with our university presses? Are there opportunities? Are there internships available? How can PhD students get to know what the university presses are doing?
So one very easy way, actually, is to talk to two recent hires. We have two recent PhDs from the university working within the university press at the moment. And I'm sure that they would be happy to talk to you, to meet with you, come and visit and talk to staff. So that's one very obvious way, but very easy way. We do actually run some intern programs. Obviously, these have been on hold over the pandemic, but we take people to come in. We have had school level 15, 16-year-olds come in to do work experience. We've had existing undergraduates, existing postgraduates come in and do some work, some intern work, or project-based work. So that there are opportunities. The only thing I would say about MUP is that we although we produce a lot of books, we're very productive. We have a staff of around 27 people, so we're not huge, but we do welcome the approaches from people to come and work with us, and we will try and find ways to do that. And in fact, we should probably do something a bit more programmatic with John through his courses, so that we can have a more formal route to do this. And I think we had discussed doing this, so we certainly will develop that. But,
I think that's something we are working on, Simon, at the moment, actually, with Chris as well, to formalize that. So, Hina, watch out for news of that.
Yeah, but don't just think about your local publishers. There are much the bigger publishers, whether they're based here in the north or more likely Oxford, London access. They do have programs, and in fact, coincidentally, the Publishers Association run a week every year called Work in Publishing, and they support publishers to do activities. I mean, I would count this as one of our Work in Publishing activities. But if you go and look at say a big trade publisher like Penguin, penguin.co.uk, you'll find that they do a great summary of the roles as videos and scenarios and interviews with people who work in various aspects of the industry. And if you want to look at specifically at more academic oriented publishing, OUP has a nice site, that's jobs.oup.com, and they have some profiles of the kinds of jobs you can do. And these bigger companies also have opportunities to go and do internships and so on.
Very good, thank you, Simon, and thanks, Hina. Maddie Hoffman asks, or says that you were able to enter this publishing world by leveraging your background in psychology. And on the kind of on the other side of things, are there ways for humanities students to enter the world of medical and scientific publishing without that background? You know, what sort of crossover is possible for students, say, from our school, which I think everybody here is for the School of Arts, Languages and Cultures, to move into these other, you know, larger and somewhat more lucrative worlds of medical and scientific?
So a lot of people who work in medical and scientific publishing don't come from scientific backgrounds. I mean, it depends. Well, I mean, at entry level positions, they're not always looking for scientific qualifications. What they're looking for is enthusiasm, real engagement with wanting to work in publishing, perhaps, you know, an appreciation of the processes and everything. So many people who end up working for medical publishers do not necessarily have a medical background. There are very high level forms of medical and scientific publishing that do require perhaps PhDs in the very subjects they're publishing in. I'm talking here about something like Nature journals. You know, they have in-house managing editors who are PhD research scientists who are managing very high level publications. But that's quite a small part of the publishing world. It is a huge enterprise, publishing, and you know, as a humanities graduate, you can get in at entry-level positions into these publishers, which is why I suggest that you don't always focus on the editorial, that you find a way in that could be through marketing, could be through sales, dare I say it again, that it just gives you a foot in, because it's once you're in a company, once you get into grips with an understanding publishing, and it's very team oriented. So, you know, you'll get to be working with editors, with marketing people if you're in, for example, sales, and you know, you do get to see other roles, and obviously with the larger companies, these roles come up, and you know, as a known quantity and someone with experience, then you have a much better chance of moving into the kind of roles that you might have originally wanted to start in.
Very good. Thank you, Maddie. Now, Matt Varco has a very good question here for which is pertinent to anybody who's doing their PhD. And Matt asks about PhD students approaching the press, working up book proposals. And do you have recommendations for people who are looking to turn their thesis into a more public-facing format?
So, first of all, what I would say is that we, as a press, and I think university presses generally are very supportive of early career researchers, and they want to help, you know, budding authors, potential authors. There's a little bit of a caveat here. We get, and university presses get, a lot of PhD submissions for publication. Now, the bottom line is that we don't publish PhDs, but we do publish works that are derived, obviously, from PhDs. They usually have to be significantly reworked. Now, in some cases, that isn't the case. We have published PhDs that were just so wonderfully written in a particular way that required perhaps not as much work as normal, but most PhDs are not published as they are. So I don't want to dissuade you from having a conversation with a publisher about developing your PhD into a book before you've finished it, partly because you should be focusing on finishing a PhD and not necessarily publishing a book, but because we normally work from the finished PhD. That's the starting position. I would say that MUP in particular has worked a lot with PhD thesis and work with relatively new ones. Sometimes it's authors who, you know, 10 years after they finish their PhD have come back and say, you know, I want to write something that basically was my PhD thesis, but, you know, for a wider audience, and that's also worked. So yes, we're obviously open to it, but be realistic about this. We are inundated with PhD theses, and you'd have to work on it. Usually, have to work on it quite a lot to get it to into a publishable form that we would be happy with.
Thanks, Simon, and thanks, Matt. And actually, there's a really useful link there in the chat that you can go to for further advice. And I think that might include a blog by one of my PhD students who now works at the press, in which she has a very candid account of how during her PhD, we are always asking our students to be able to prepare to defend their research for vivas. And there are elements of being able to square your work away in relation to that viva, which don't quite fit with the fluent argument that you will expect in the framing of a book. So the PhD goes in a little bit of a different direction, Simon, I think is what you were saying, to the direction you want your book to go into. So, well, I think that might be the last of the questions from those of you who are there. But Simon, I had, just to finish off, really just one or two further questions. And one is, and you sort of answered this already, but I'm just trying to imagine, if you're looking at what, I think I know the answer, and the answer book begins with the word S and the letter S and ends with the word S. But what do you look for in your ideal candidate? If you had a Swiss Army knife candidate who had this skill and that skill and this skill and that skill, what are the key skills that you're looking for in somebody who you want to take on in, an initial role at the company?
Well, I mentioned the word before. I think enthusiasm and a real interest and commitment to publishing, it goes a long way. But beyond that, it's if you were to use the Swiss Army knife analogy, I guess the Swiss Army knife is basically a tool that allows you to solve many problems, or at least attempt to solve them. But you're coming armed with a lot of equipment there. So in publishing, I think it does, particularly at the entry level, it does pay to be able to not just specialize and be brilliant at what you're doing, but actually to take a real interest in both the upstream and downstream of what's happening in a publishing house. Because you may be sitting in production and feel, well, actually you shouldn't feel distant from the author, because you're actually probably going to work as much with the author as the editorial commissioning editor would have done. And then also, you're working with the marketing department on schedules and timing, and they will be looking for endorsements and so on. So what I would say is that someone who is flexible and willing to learn and look outside of their own particular area, I think it's those people I've seen succeed that are really interested in everything about publishing, not just editorial, not just marketing, whatever. But they love the whole process. And I think that, obviously you wouldn't know whether you love the whole process until you're in it, but I think it's a rewarding career in a way, because it is a creative industry, it's a cultural industry, it's a knowledge industry. It allows you to work with some of the smartest people that you're ever likely to meet. And some of those might even be your colleagues. But with authors, researchers, and academics, working with ideas that you may not have had an opportunity to engage with in any depth, it can be really rewarding. And for me, I've always really enjoyed the idea of making a project work. Actually creating something, which is why I think the physical book is still very powerful and still very much in demand. It's that you have not only do you have this wonderful looking physical object at the end of it, but it's full of information, of ideas and things. It's a very powerful thing, very simple in a way, but obviously the books can change the world. And while what you do in publishing may not be seen as life and death, and it isn't unless you're working in very high-end, fast-moving medical publishing, there are books that do potentially change people's lives. And I think if you have that kind of engagement and interest in publishing, then you should go for it. It's, as I say, I found it a very rewarding career. If you are interested in the commercial side, which I actually am, university presses are typically not-for-profit organizations, but and I like the mission-oriented, the purpose side of what we do, but in the end, it'd be nice if we could make a profit so we could do more of what we do. You know, profit isn't a dirty word. It's a good thing. It's a measure of a success that actually people do on your product. They are willing to pay for it and subscribe to it. So you know, you see most of business in publishing, but it's special because it's dealing with ideas.
Very good. But I think that's a good note to leave it on, about that enthusiasm for what it is the books can do, that publishing makes possible. Simon, thank you very much for kicking off this series, and we'll be back next week. And I would say this series is run with MUP and Creative Manchester. And next week it's going to be Luke Brown who's going to be talking to us. And Luke has had also had a different kind of a career in publishing, working with regional press, working with Arts Council funded publishing, then working in magazine publishing, and now working as a commissioning fiction editor for a leading London independent press, Serpent's Tail. And so he'll be talking a little bit about the different aspects of the work and the different kinds of skills involved and how those different companies engage with graduates as well. So I hope I'll see many of you here again next Friday. We're on Zoom again next week. And I should say as well that if you have friends across the school or fellow MA and PhD students in the school, we are going to be posting this to the school Blackboard, so it will be available on Monday for people who were unable to come along this evening. So do tell them that it will be there, and the resource will be available to them for the rest of the semester. And I will see some of you then. Thanks very much, Simon, and thanks to Becca as well behind the scenes. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Goodbye.